Okay, we're going to stay with Gaza and turn to our next guest, who is Humza Yousaf, the former First Minister of Scotland. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Arabiya English. I remember when we talked before, we talked about your in-laws, your parents-in-law, who are now back in Scotland. They were, of course, trapped in Gaza, Elizabeth and Majid al-Nakla. I wanted to ask how they're doing and also how the rest of the family is, because you still have ties, don't you, to Gaza?
We do. Thanks, Tom. It's good to speak to you again, though I wish things had improved since the last time we spoke. In fact, they've, of course, got much worse. And every day it seems like the situation is worsening and becoming more horrific. In terms of my in-laws, what can I say? They are traumatized. I think they will always be thus, I'm afraid. And in terms of the family in Gaza itself, my wife, Nadia, she has her first cousin, Sally, there. Sally has 4 children and a husband. And those 4 children, as every day is going on, are losing weight, becoming emaciated, and are starving in front, not just of her eyes, in her arms. So how can I possibly describe that situation? Are there any adjectives left to describe the horror that the people of Gaza are facing as a daily occurrence? So I don't really have the words to tell you how horrific the situation is for Nadia's family in Gaza. And of course, that is replicated amongst hundreds of thousands, in fact, millions of families in Gaza that are left there living this daily nightmare on a daily basis.
Now, thank you for that update. And I mean, I wanted to ask you about something you've put out on X, because you wrote on the platform formerly known as Twitter in response to yesterday's bombing by Israel of the Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. You said something that began, "Dear Prime Ministers and Presidents." Presumably had the British Prime Minister in mind when you started writing that. What would you like him to be doing?
Well, I'd like him to take some meaningful action. Today, the UK Prime Minister has described that double tap bombing of Al Nasser Hospital. Let's remind ourselves what we saw. We saw an Israeli airstrike on a hospital, killing journalists, killing civilians. And then as emergency workers went to rescue the injured, another airstrike followed. And this one was actually caught on camera. We know that's happened many times before. The Israeli Prime Minister calling it a mishap. A mishap is when you accidentally CC in the wrong colleague into an email. It's not when you kill emergency workers and bomb a hospital. So the UK Prime Minister today has responded by calling that, and I quote using his words, indefensible. Well, if that action is indefensible, which of course it clearly is, then why on earth does the UK government continue to sell weapons to the government of Israel? Why does it continue with RAF reconnaissance flights that directly give intelligence to the Israeli regime? And why on earth do they continue to train, the UK army continue to train IDF soldiers? So at the very least, the complicity, the support that we give the Israeli regime must be completely withdrawn, and then proactively sanctions must be imposed on a nation, a rogue nation, that is clearly, completely and utterly out of control.
I mean, you've repeatedly drawn parallels with apartheid South Africa, and I'm wondering if you're doing that because you think that the same sort of action that was taken then needs to be taken now.
Well, firstly, I'm doing it because, of course, it is the ICJ itself that has said Israel's policies in the West Bank are a breach of the Apartheid Convention. This is not Humza Yousaf's subjective opinion. This is the ICJ who have said that Israel is in breach of its obligations against apartheid and racial segregation. That's first and foremost why the comparison is being made. And secondly, that yes, we know that in particularly the 70s and 80s, the measures taken by the international community, by nations across the world to isolate South Africa, to essentially boycott South Africa, particularly in relation to sporting and cultural events, and to impose meaningful sanctions, was the only way that ended up resulting in the dismantling of the apartheid regime. So all these statements of condemnation, these feeble words that are coming from presidents and prime ministers across the world in relation to Israel's actions are falling on deaf ears. The only language that Israel will understand, I believe, is meaningful sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of South Africa, I mean, the sanctions took 3 decades from the early 1960s to the late 1980s to have the full effect. And of course, the UK and the United States came on board very late in the game. And, you know, the people of Gaza don't have 3 decades to wait. But do you think the bottom line is that Washington can stop Israel? And why don't they?
Yes, you're right. Of course, people of Gaza don't have 3 decades. They barely have days. I mean, there is mass starvation, deliberate mass starvation, of course, which the IPC has confirmed is famine in Gaza City, likely to spread across the whole strip. So we need urgent action, meaningful action, tough action that is going to ensure that Israel changes course. But of course, you're right. As long as the United States provides carte blanche, then Israel will continue, I'm afraid, to commit breaches of international law with impunity. So what has to happen? I think if you are truly an ally of the United States, then all of those that might have influence with Trump's White House have to stop pandering, have to stop simply turning up to the White House full of platitudes and praise, but actually begin to say that, look, we are facing a genocide that is taking place. I don't think there's anybody that seriously doubts that anymore. And we do not want to be complicit in it. And we do not want you to be complicit in it. So look, there has to be measures that are taken. And if the United States is unhappy at those measures, then I would urge countries to work in concert with each other in the way that, for example, Ireland, Norway and Spain did last year in order to come together and collectively recognise the state of Palestine. But urgent action is needed. Otherwise, there won't be tens of thousands of people that will lose their life. It will be hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people.
Humza, yesterday we spoke to an Israeli academic who suggested that the people of Gaza be relocated or rehoused, I think he said, to other countries. And he gave Indonesia as being one of the other countries where they might be rehoused. I mean, what's your reading of what Israel is trying to do in Gaza and, for that matter, in the West Bank? What are they trying to achieve?
Ethnic cleansing. I mean, it is the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing to forcibly remove one people and replace them with another people. That is the textbook definition of ethnic cleansing. And of course, Israel has form. If I think about my wife's grandmother, who was 16 years old when the Nakba happened in 1948, she was living in her home in a town called Julis, which no longer exists, near what is now called Ashkelon. She was told to leave her house for a couple of weeks, and when the fighting calmed down, then she'd be able to go back home. 77 years later, she, of course, will never return home. She's been made a refugee for a second time, and she was, of course, one of around 700,000 who were forcibly displaced, removed, dispossessed from their homes in 1948. So Israel has form of forcibly removing and ethnically cleansing people from their land. And that is exactly what they want to do with Gaza. And if Israel does not stop, not only will they completely flatten, as they have done, Gaza and populate it and ethnically cleanse the population, the real prize for them, of course, is the West Bank, where they've already continuing to approve illegal settlement after illegal settlement. So this is a rogue nation, and the only language a rogue nation will understand will be meaningful sanctions and tough action from the international community.
Specifically on this idea of Indonesia, I mean, what's your reaction when you hear someone saying, an academic in Israel, saying that the people of one place should be moved tens of thousands of kilometers away and transplanted, so to speak, to Indonesia? What goes through your mind when you hear that?
Well, I think every decent-minded person will think that that is an atrocious suggestion, which is an attempt to ethnically cleanse a population. But let's be clear, if anybody sees the clips, translated clips of Israeli talk shows or a number of Israeli politicians, including, of course, senior government ministers, that will not come as a surprise. They openly talk about, nay, they boast about ethnically cleansing the population of Gaza. So I don't think ever in my lifetime have I seen both a genocide live streamed and those who are committing the crimes boast in open about their intentions with the population to ethnically cleanse them. So we're being told what Israel wants to do, and the international community, I'm afraid, is passive, letting it happen, and it's people of Gaza that are suffering as a result.
We all watch coverage of what's happening in Gaza all around the world. People are seeing the horrific images, and then we hear Israeli officials giving justifications or denials for what we're seeing. What personally is the thing or the message you hear from Israeli commentators or senior figures that you find most irritating and most dishonest? Is there one thing that really stands out for you?
Well, a number of things, but of course, when the Prime Minister of Israel talks about the IDF being the most moral army in the world, I'm afraid the nation is becoming the most immoral nation in the world, because what it is doing, and the government is doing, is of course war crime after war crime. Whether it was 5-year-old Hind Rajab, who is in a car peppered with 335 bullets, whether it's journalists, whether it's humanitarian workers, whether it's hospitals, whether it's schools being bombed, every single convention, even in war times and conflict, is being broken by Israel and broken with impunity, breached with impunity. And what I would say to the international community is, if you even take Gaza and Palestine out of the picture for a minute, what you are doing is setting a precedent that says that every single country can now have impunity to break international law, because there'll be no accountability. There'll be no accountability even if there's an ICC arrest warrant wanted in your name. And the global ramifications for that make our world a far more dangerous place, not a safer one.
Turning our attentions to where you are now in the United Kingdom, I'm just wondering how divisive this issue of the plight of the Palestinians is there in the UK. I mean, would it be too simplistic to say the division is on political lines, left, right, or is it more complicated than that?
It is more complicated than that. Look, there's good people, even in, for example, the Conservative Party, who have been advocating for the rights of the Palestinian people. I give a special mention to Kit Malthouse MP, who I think has made some phenomenally good contributions in the House of Commons. And he's a Conservative Member of Parliament, who again is not talking about being pro-Palestinian or pro-Arab or pro-Muslim, but simply pro-humanity. So there are people across society, across nationalities, political divides, backgrounds, ethnicities, who again are not supporting the Palestinian cause because they somehow are biased towards Arabs, Palestinians or Muslims. It's because they are witnessing the scenes of genocide live streamed on our televisions every day and saying humanity is losing here, that we are losing every shred and every ounce of our humanity if we do not stop this. And there cannot be repercussions and there cannot be accountability for the slaughter of 17,000 children and over 60,000 innocent men, women and children.
You didn't mention the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer or David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary there. Do you think they are simply not speaking up enough? Their actions and words are inadequate?
I think they're in danger of being complicit. That's the problem. They are making statements that say that the actions of Israel are indefensible. I think David Lammy yesterday described the situation as a moral outrage. Well, you cannot claim it's indefensible and it's a moral outrage, and yet continue to sell arms, weapons, provide intelligence, give support, continue to support the infrastructure of occupation and indeed genocide that is taking place at the moment. So, of course, their actions are wholly inadequate, and I'm afraid are, in my view, making them complicit in one of the worst crimes of the century, and certainly the worst crime that I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Just watching British television, there's been, some protests in the last couple of days. I mean, there are always protests, it seems, but I mean, there does seem to be a tense political climate in the United Kingdom at the moment and a rising nationalist sentiment, which isn't new, but the trend seems to be continuing. I mean, what do you make of what you're seeing? And do you see this issue of the plight of the Palestinians as somehow feeding into this political set of circumstances?
Well, look, frankly, every single issue ends up being sucked into the culture wars that seem to be consuming the UK, Europe, and most of the Western world. I could tell you that the sky is blue outside, and somehow that would be a controversial statement that I'm making. So the culture war, I'm afraid, is consuming every single issue, including, of course, the Palestinian cause. In terms of the so-called anti-immigration protests that we're witnessing in the UK, including we've seen some here in Scotland, are not happening in a vacuum. You've had 20 years, if not more, of anti-migrant rhetoric from the main political parties in Westminster, whether they be Labour or Tory. And that, of course, at a time when this country requires immigration. We have the lowest birth rates on record. We have an aging population, and that, of course, is the story of the Western European continent. This country and this continent, indeed, relies on immigration, relies on the contribution that migrants make, and yet has created the most hostile atmosphere for migration. And it will lead to not only societal catastrophe, but economic collapse.
And yet, I mean, looking at the latest opinion polls, it seems like the Reform Party, with Nigel Farage very much as its figurehead, are riding high in the polls. What do you make of that? I mean, are we looking, do you think, at the future Prime Minister of the UK, Nigel Farage?
I don't think there's a single political commentator that would bet against Nigel Farage, at the very least being the leader of the opposition, possibly even getting the keys to 10 Downing Street, and shudder at the thought that this is a man who's claimed, often insinuated, that Muslims don't share British values, that has said that some Muslims are a fifth column in this country trying to kill us. If there is a dog whistle to be blown, then you will find Nigel Farage at the front of the queue with his lips pursed and ready to blow. So we have here a very dangerous individual. His reason for support, of course, is because of the political failures, particularly of Westminster parties. We've seen with the last Conservative government, the biggest fall in the living standards since records began. So if people's weekly shop has gone up, if their mortgage has gone up, their rent has gone up, their electricity bill, their gas bill, all of these bills have gone up, and they've had a Conservative Party, a Labour Party, then of course they're going to try something new, something different. And that's why I think Reform are seeing their support in the polls riding high, including here in Scotland, where I am. That should worry every single decent-minded person.
Right, you say you shudder at the thought of Nigel Farage as the future British Prime Minister. And as a Muslim, I'm wondering what that would mean for you, such a prospect. What would it mean for you and your family? Would you go and live somewhere else? Would you sort of close the door on the UK?
Well, look, I wouldn't want to do that. I love Scotland. It's my country. I was born here, raised here, raising a family here, and I had the great honour and privilege of serving my country, both as a government minister, but also, of course, for a period as the head of government, as the First Minister of Scotland. So, you could cut me in half and I would bleed Scotland. So I don't want to leave my country and wouldn't want to be forced out of my country. At the same time, the other role, responsibility, in fact, the most important role and responsibility I have is as a father. And with the United Kingdom becoming more and more hostile to Muslims, to the point where we've had bricks thrown through mosque windows, we've had the attempted terrorist attack in a mosque in Scotland, in fact, with the individual, a teenager, being charged to 10 years in prison for his affiliation with neo-Nazism and his attempt at that terror attack against a mosque in the west of Scotland. So if the climate becomes so unsafe for Muslims, many Muslims, myself included, of course, will be questioning whether our children can possibly be safe in this country. And if not, then we will be elsewhere. And again, that will not be good, clearly, for society, I would argue. It certainly won't help the economy of the country if all the Muslims decide to pack up and go elsewhere, as many in the far right have been calling for.
Okay, and just, I mean, before we just close and one last question about Gaza, I just wanted to ask you, I mean, you're quoted as having said sometime last year that people make a living out of vilifying Muslims. And I mean, obviously it sounds like you think Nigel Farage is one of them. Who else did you have in mind when you said that?
Well, I think there's plenty of examples you can see online of these hate preachers. Today I just saw a woman who is looking to be, I think, a Republican candidate in Texas, taking a flamethrower to a Quran in the name of free speech. And that is the kind of world I'm living in. Somebody who wants to be taken seriously as a candidate in the local parliament, Senate, taking such action. So there are plenty of people, I'm afraid, who have made a living and are making a living of being rabidly anti-Muslim, and many of them get platformed. You will hear, many an anti-Muslim statement that I can point to from the likes of Melanie Phillips, and yet she was given a platform in the BBC with regularity. So time and time again, Islamophobia, the hatred of Muslims, is not just accepted, but is platformed on our mainstream. And that is entirely, in my view, unacceptable.
And that's a good place to end this conversation, because I wanted to wrap up by asking you about your criticism of British broadcasters, in particular with regards to their choices of words relating to the situation in Gaza. What sort of words do you criticise them for using or not using? And do you think British broadcasters have an agenda on this issue?
Well, I think what a lot of broadcasters, and I put the BBC in this category, attempt to do in the name of impartiality is bring balance to a situation that's fundamentally imbalanced. So how on earth can you bring balance to a situation where one group of people, in the case of Gaza, do not have an army, are not an independent nation, who are being bombarded by one of the most sophisticated military machines that are dropping 2,000-pound bombs on their heads? That's not a balanced situation. That situation is systemically and fundamentally imbalanced. And so what we see from, often again, the BBC, but they're not the only one, is such poor choice. One has to wonder if it is deliberately poor choice of wording in order to mask the true reality of what is happening. And that can be in the West Bank, where the BBC recently had a headline calling settlements a controversial plan. They're not controversial, they're illegal, of course, under international law. Or often when they're reporting about Gaza, they simply mention that people, dozens of people were killed. Well, killed by whom? And often talking about the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza, but not when they mention Israel, don't mention the fact that is a government led by a man who's wanted by the ICC for war crimes. And look, the other thing I would say about, I'm afraid, that Western media, that with a few notable exceptions, because there has been some notable exceptions, the fact that so many journalists have been killed in Gaza, you have barely heard a peep from Western journalists about their colleagues being slaughtered in such numbers. And I think that is extremely shameful and extremely regrettable.
Okay, well, it's been great speaking to Humza Yousaf, former First Minister of Scotland. Thank you for your time. And I do hope that if you're in the Middle East, you will come and talk to us. Thank you very much indeed.